Hey, welcome along. The 17th anniversary of 9/11 passed a couple of days ago, and with the passage of time, it's hard to maintain the righteous anger of that day itself, so the anniversaries perforce seem less and less significant as the years go by. But I wanted to, I don't particularly like the way we commemorate that event these days, the ceremonies in Lower Manhattan and elsewhere. There's a bit too much limpid passivity about it for my tastes, so I let it go. But I do want to just say a couple of words about the big picture, because although most of us understood on that day in the immediate aftermath that we were in on something big and long term that would necessarily consume much of the ensuing decades, we're not exactly where I would have expected us to be 17 years ago. My kind of view on the post 9/11 scene was clarified about 6 months after September 11th. I went to the Middle East. I was planning a trip to the Middle East, and I was going to a lot of countries that frankly aren't high on anybody's favorite tourist destinations. So I thought I'd treat myself beforehand and go to some of the places that were. So I went, for example, to Paris. And I had a look at the Paris banlieue, the seething Muslim suburbs that ring the city. In effect, what we think of as downtown Paris is a little kind of Maurice Chevalier hole in an Islamic donut. And I went to Brussels, same kind of thing. I went to Vienna, and I was astonished. I'd never seen the banlieues in France. I hadn't been to Molenbeek in Brussels for years. And I understood just from walking the streets that we were in the midst of a great demographic transformation. And then I went to Vienna, and I went to a maternity store in Vienna where you buy things for ladies who are expecting babies and stuff for the baby and whatnot. And almost every woman in there was a covered woman, that's to say a Muslim woman. Now this is Austria. This is a country that until very recently was 90% Catholic. And by the middle of this century, the Vienna Institute of Demography, which is one of the few European institutions that actually keeps track of these things, because it's a bit too culturally sensitive for most of the other countries. But the Vienna Institute of Demography actually keeps track of these things and says that by the middle of this century, a majority of Austrians under the age of 15 will be Muslim, which means that Austria's future is as a Muslim nation. So you go back to your images of Austria, which for most people who aren't Austrian comes from The Sound of Music. So you think about Salzburg, 1938, Julie Andrews, a bunch of capering nuns. How do you solve a problem like Maria? And you pitch it forward a century to 2038, and Austria, the big question is, how do you solve a problem like Sharia? That's in 1 century. It sounds ridiculous, but demographic changes happen, and they happen faster than people think, because at a certain point you reach a tipping point, un point de bascule, as we say in French. And once you reach the point de bascule, there's not a lot you can do. The process sort of falls in on itself and accelerates. And I found this absolutely fascinating, because political people especially are very interested in demography. You know this if you're American or you're Canadian or you're Australian. They'll talk about, relatively modest shifts in certain congressional districts or parliamentary constituencies where They say, well, this used to be quite a rural conservative constituency, but with suburbanization, it's now got far more Democrat-leaning soccer moms or whatever. Normally, political analysts, consultants, everybody are fascinated by small demographic changes. Yet this huge demographic change didn't seem to interest anybody in Europe at all, at least not to the point where they were willing to speak about it. I wrote a book about it, a best-selling book, international best-selling book. A lot of prime ministers and presidents and foreign ministers read it. And at one point, Christopher Hitchens asked Tony Blair about the demographic thesis of the book and said, it asked him whether, when he got together with his fellow European prime ministers, whether it was part of what he called the European conversation. And Tony Blair replied, well, it's part of the subterranean conversation, by which he meant that in these supposedly democratic societies, all these democratic leaders hadn't figured out a way to talk about these demographic transformations. And for me, that actually changed the way I looked on 9/11. And as I said, it's part of that is my disappointment 17 years on, that we're not where we thought we would be. Where we are is Afghanistan, where we were in the fall of 2001. We've been running around that country for 17 years. And every time we think we're getting near to the exit point, the generals or whoever double down, and we're told we have to stay there again for another 2, 3, 4 years or whatever. So, welcome to Afghanifornia, a Hotel Afghanifornia. You can check out any time you like, but you can never leave. And there's no point to running around Afghanistan. I'm an old school imperialist, and old school imperialists figured that it wasn't worth incorporating Afghanistan in Britain's Indian Empire for very good reasons. But if you're not an old school imperialist, there's no good reason for spending 17 years in Afghanistan with no strategic goals. Shortly before the 9/11 anniversary, we heard of the latest American fatality in Afghanistan, Sergeant Major Timothy Bolyard, who was killed by a member of the Afghan National Police that he and his fellow Western soldiers had been training. In other words, American troops are being killed by the Afghan policemen they train. After 17 years. Next year, or if not the year after, 2019, 2020, we will have the first American fatality of a soldier who was born after 9/11, killed by one of the policemen or soldiers we've been there training for 17, 18, 19, 20 years. In Bob Woodward's book, he cites as evidence of the fact that Trump is stupid by citing the president's question in a meeting of generals and political figures sitting around talking about Afghanistan, and he's trying to get them to say, what's the strategy for victory here? When are we going to start winning some wars? What is the mission in Afghanistan? What are our war aims in Afghanistan? And in Bob Woodward's book, this is presented as evidence that the president is an idiot. I don't know about that, but I do know one consequence of these Afghan wars. 17 years in Afghanistan. As I say, 24 hours after the last Western soldier leaves, it will be as if we were never there. 17 years after we've been there, the Taliban now controls more territory in Afghanistan than it has since September 2001. Meanwhile, what else has happened? You can read these stories literally any day of the week. These are all from a couple of days. German migrants. Protesters march over young man's death in Curtin. A 22-year-old German died following an alleged fight with Afghan men. In the German papers, everything is alleged. If you ever go to Germany, you'll know they never give you the real names of anybody in these crime stories. They just give them the first name and the initials. So to find out what's going on, you generally, as I did a couple of years ago, you have to actually go to these German towns, find somebody who knew the person who's been stabbed or a relative of the person who did the stabbing to be able to identify them in any way, because the German papers, by agreement, don't. So this 22-year-old German died. 2 Afghan suspects have been arrested. He died because he intervened when he saw 3 Afghan men harassing a pregnant woman. That's this story out of Germany. Here we have 2 Britons are among 7 people injured as Afghan who posed as child migrant goes on knife rampage through Paris before pétanque players throw boule to disarm him. This is like the perfect cultural shorthand for what's going on in France. If you've ever been in some sleepy French village where all the old-timers are playing boule, playing pétanque in the centre of town, here there's this guy who's going on a stabbing rampage, and the only way they can stop him is for the pétanque player to hurl their boule at him. The suspect is an Afghan in his 30s, but carrying child identity documents. So he's a child refugee, so you can't do anything about him. And if you're thinking, wait a minute, two Britons are among 7 people stabbed in Paris. I thought it was 2 Americans who were among the people stabbed in Amsterdam. No, that was the day before's story. That was the day before's story. 2 American tourists injured by another Afghan, a 19-year-old Afghan who stabbed 2 Americans at the main train station in Amsterdam. What else we got here? Oh yeah, a guy, I think he managed to get to both of Lyon's airports. There's a big airport and a small airport in France. He tried to ram his car into the airline terminal, yelling Allahu Akbar, which, as the blogger Blazing Cat put it, we all know Allahu Akbar is Arabic for, can you tell me if this is the long-term parking terminal? So this guy comes running into the concourse, mows down a couple of people shouting Allahu Akbar. You can find stories like this every day of the week now. Afghan refugees. We've been there for 17 years, and mysteriously everywhere's filled up with Afghans. How can that possibly be? I don't know. Is this guy an Afghan? Ibrahim Ali, 28, charged with first-degree murder of a Burnaby teenager, Marissa Shen. This is out of Burnaby, British Columbia, the Vancouver Sun. I don't know. I don't know whether he's an Afghan. Might be from Syria or Libya or one of the other countries Western intervention has managed to fix over the last 17 years. All these Afghans, we've been in Afghanistan for 17 years, longer than the United States has been in any war. And the result is Christendom, to use a quaint term. The Western world, whatever you want to call it, has filled up with Afghans who are stabbing people, driving cars into people, all over France, Germany, the Netherlands, wherever it is. We have a contradiction here. September 11th, if you remember this at the time, they used to say September 11th was the day that everything changed. What principally changed was that the rate of Muslim immigration to the Western world doubled. That's an extraordinary statistic. You know, people argue about the Second World War, about whether America was right to intern Japanese Americans or whatever. And you can have a debate about that. But what people didn't have to argue about was that if FDR, in order to virtue signal, had decided to double the rate of Japanese immigration to the United States, if his reaction to Pearl Harbor had been to double the rate of Japanese immigration to America. And so we have a contradiction here. We've got this war back to front. We run around fighting for worthless, barren bits of the most useless real estate on the planet, like Helmand Province in Afghanistan, while every day we surrender some of the most valuable real estate on the planet, like Toulouse in France, or Gothenburg in Sweden, or this Belgian town, that German town, that Dutch town, that English town. And these positions are contradictory. They were the late John McCain, a man of forthright views and many admirable qualities, nevertheless never accepted the incoherence of his position, was that he wanted American boots on the ground everywhere on the map. You couldn't find anywhere he didn't want to send American troops into. There are pictures of him in Syria with guys who he assumed were the good guys, and he's standing next to them smiling. And a couple of months down the road, it turns on that they're the guys who left ISIS because they didn't think it was hardcore enough. So he wanted to have boots on the ground everywhere. But at the same time, he wanted essentially open borders, and for all these Afghans and Syrians and Libyans and Sudanese and Yemeni and from wherever the hell it is we're going next, all to be able to move to the Western world. And I think my point is it's not difficult. In fact, it's rather obvious. You know, why fight for Raqqa rather than Rotterdam? Why fight for Kandahar rather than Cannes? In any war, you have to be able to prioritize. What would you rather do? Run around Afghanistan for another 17 years, or get serious about the defense of the West? Instead of, as administration officials said last year, you know, never again will we allow our enemies to have safe havens in Afghanistan. Well, whoop-de-doo, they're not going to need safe havens in Afghanistan. As you can tell from that little rippling of the day's news stories, they've actually got safe havens in Paris, safe havens in Stockholm, safe havens in Berlin, safe havens in Amsterdam, safe havens in Nice, safe havens in Birmingham, safe havens in Manchester, safe havens in London. Which of those safe havens is likely to be more valuable to them? Who's winning what turf? After 17 years of Allied military occupation, the Taliban control more of Afghanistan than they have since the fall of 2001. On the other hand, after 17 years of accelerating Islamic immigration, Europe has more no-go zones, more Sharia courts, more quote-unquote refugees, more covered women, more Muslim-dominated schoolhouses, more grooming, more gang rape. Yeah, here's the stupid tweet of the day from South Yorkshire Police. In addition to reporting hate crime, please report non-crime hate incidents, which can include things like offensive or insulting comments, online, in person, or in writing. Hate will not be tolerated in South Yorkshire. Report it and put a stop to it. Get lost, copper. Your job, if you want to critique writing, go off and be a literary critic, not a policeman. That's not a proper business of the constabulary. And the idea that hate will not be tolerated in South Yorkshire. Rotherham is in South Yorkshire. Rotherham is in the South Yorkshire Police's jurisdiction. I went to Rotherham. It's a miserable place. I spent far too long there. I spoke to young ladies who'd been doused in petrol while men danced around them, threatening to set them alight. They'd been dangled off balconies, all kinds of things. And when they went to South Yorkshire Police, the South Yorkshire Police were in on it and didn't want to know. Just this week, sample headline from South Yorkshire, Sheffield Crown Court, that's the biggest city in South Yorkshire. Young girl was, quote, passed around and had sex with 100 Asian men by age of 16, unquote. Child sex abuse trial here's. So stop with your monitoring tweets and Facebook, you lazy, useless coppers. Do your job and protect the young women folk of your towns, of Sheffield and Rotherham. That's what we have to show for 17 years. More radical mosques, more female genital mutilation to the point where hospitals all over the world have to specialize in it, more Muslim Brotherhood front groups, and fewer churches, because they close, and fewer gays in Amsterdam, and fewer Jews in Toulouse, where they've had to merge all into one fortress-like synagogue, and fewer women who go out uncovered at night in German and Swedish cities. In Afghanistan, we're fighting for something not worth winning and we're losing. In Europe, Islam is fighting for something very much worth winning, and they're advancing every day. And that is ridiculous, and it's the contradiction of 9/11. And it's funny because as I think of it now, I guess in a certain sense these are hot wars and cold wars, such as we've always had. And the hot war is being fought out in Afghanistan and Syria and flares up in Libya, Yemen, whatever, and we get all excited about it, at least if you're John McCain and Lindsey Graham and you want somewhere else to put boots on the ground. But the Cold War that's going on every day throughout the Western world is actually more important. And in some strange way, this endless 17-year dithering around in Afghanistan actually prevents us seeing what's going on in the heart of the Western world with any strategic clarity whatsoever. And until we make the connection between these two things and actually start to think of them as a kind of organic whole, we're not going to get anywhere on this. At least our present leadership isn't. You know, it was interesting to me, they've just had an election in Sweden. And basically the so-called centre-left bloc got 40-point-something%, and the centre-right bloc got 40-point-something%, and everything else, just under 20%, went to the Sweden Democrats, who are described as this fringe far-right party. And everyone was terrified that they were going to crack 20% and come out the number one party in Sweden. And so in a sense, the fact that they failed to do that means that everyone can now, all the media in Europe, and Sweden has among the worst media in Europe, can now write these stories about, oh, the Sweden Democrats didn't do quite as well as they thought they were going to do. It doesn't matter whether they got 20%, 18%, 17.6%. When you're that high, when you're the third biggest party, you are by definition not the fringe. And so just calling them fringe far-right parties isn't going to work anymore. But I watched the final leadership debate of these Swedish party leaders, and all of them, they were like, I forget what it was, 7 or 8 guys on stage there, and women too, they're very big on that. The current government describes itself as the first feminist government in the world. They're very big on all that. And what was interesting to me was that they were saying things that just 10 years ago, 5 years ago, they would have denounced as hate crimes. The Conservative leader spoke about immigrant crime and immigrant murder. The Christian Democrat guy, she was talking about honor crime, where that's where girls get tossed off Swedish balconies or in apartment buildings because they date a Western guy or whatever. The Liberals spoke about the schools that were run by Salafists, the hardcore radical Muslims, in which Swedish taxpayers in effect pay for hardcore radical Salafists to radicalize Swedish, so-called Swedish children. None of these things would have been said 5 years ago. So in effect, they said, their argument was, you don't need to vote for the far-right Sweden Democrats because we're going to steal enough of his clothes to retain some credibility on this issue. And you know how it goes with these things. The political conversation, what Tony Blair called the subterranean conversation, is getting less and less subterranean. And people are demanding the right to talk about it. When we did one of our Tales for Our Times, our audiobooks recently, I mentioned a great John Buchan line delivered by one of his characters, Sandy Arbuthnot, in his story, The Three Hostages. I had a lot to do, Sandy complains, and nothing wastes time like dodging assassins. And it's a cool line, as delivered by Sandy Arbuthnot. It was a cool line when I read it as a schoolboy, because some rogue had just made 4 attempts to murder him in different countries. Nothing wastes time like dodging assassins. What a cool line, I thought, when I read it as a teenager. Wasting time in dodging assassins has now become the organizing principle of Western life. Your time is wasted every time you have to catch a flight from Cleveland to Atlanta by having to shuffle shoeless through the airport. Your time is wasted every time you have to line up for an Ariana Grande pop concert and turn out all your possessions because the last time they held an Ariana Grande pop concert, some nut blew it up. Your time is wasted every time you have to go to a Bastille Day celebration in France or a Christmas market in Germany. And you have to stand in line, shuffle past the bollards, just in case some guy gets in a truck and decides to mow you all down on the sidewalk. A century ago, in John Buchan's day, only cool guys with exciting lives got to dodge assassins. Now, as I said, it is increasingly becoming the organizing principle of daily life. 2 wars, 17 years, dithering around in the Hindu Kush for a land that is worth, in total, maybe half the price of Barbara Streisand's terrace in Malibu. And on the other hand, the heart of the Western world, great Western cities, where people are living smaller, cramped lives because of the insane immigration policies implemented by European leaders. These 2 battlegrounds are part of the same story, and it is time we learned to prioritize. I'll see you next time.